You're sitting in a dark movie theater. The lights go down. You're settling into your seat, turning your phone off and putting it into your pocket. If not for the muttering and shifting of the audience around you, the room would be utterly silent. In this moment of pause, you may feel unnerved, uneasy, or chilled by the absence of sound. Maybe you even feel nervous that the slightest fidget will break the oppressive silence around you. Before the movie even begins, you are anxious. I've loved horror since I was a kid. I grew up watching movies like Coraline and reading Stephen King books. Thank you, Dad, for that very traumatizing experience at the age of 10. But because I fell in love with the way it made me feel. I fell in love with the anxiety-inducing page turns, the suspense before the film opened on screen, the way that no matter what film or book it was, I always left it feeling abuzz with excitement and adrenaline. And part of me wondered why. Why in the world would I fall in love with this genre, which had the sole purpose of terrifying and disgusting me in every way possible? My immediate assumption was that I loved being scared, like some sort of masochist, but I'm decidedly not a masochist, thank God and hopefully, but rather, so there must be something else. And we can only figure out what this abstract something is when we consider the context of the horror genre itself. So, what is horror? Well, the horror genre is something of an umbrella term that encapsulates a lot of smaller subgenres. Slasher horror, sci-fi horror, supernatural horror, found footage horror, folk horror, the list goes on literally forever. But what unites all of these smaller subgenres together are two things. One, a tapping into our evolutionary fears, and two, exploration of our socioculturally based fears. Evolutionary fears can be described as fears contingent upon our base human instincts. A fear of the dark, small spaces, a loss of control, and most relevant for our purposes here today, the unknown, to name a few. In contrast, these cultural fears are much more difficult to describe in general terms as they're contingent upon our culture, something that fluctuates very quickly, especially in our modern day. However, some of our most pertinent fears in culture today would be things like foreign threats, issues of privacy and security, and fear of oppression from powerful groups. These two concepts overlap in a lot of ways, and often what we get as a result of this are films with plot points, characters, settings, or themes related to our present culture that are then supplemented with these inherent fears. These supplemental factors might look like a film that takes place in dank, dark spaces, or a film with trippy sequences that mess with our heads. However, these supplementals aren't necessarily inherent to the plot, there they are. Rather, they seek to emphasize our base human instincts. In contrast, these cultural aspects aren't so simply implemented. And thus, to further explore this idea of overlap, we must take a look at a film that I consider to be a prime example of this idea. The 1956 film Invasion of the Body Snatchers follows our two main characters, Dr. Miles Bennell and Becky Driscoll, as they attempt to outsmart and outrun an ever-worsening alien infection in their little suburban American town of Santa Maria, California. Right off the bat, we see the emergence of this idea of inherent fears. For one, the concept of the alien invasion has been used in horror films for literal decades, and for good reason. It's practically the most literal representation of the unknown that one can make. And when this idea is supplemented with the fact that the quote-unquote aliens in this film are actually the hollowed-out husks of the townspeople, you end up with a film that discusses not only the fear of the unknown, but the fear of the familiar. We watch as Miles becomes aware of what initially presents itself as a mass hysteria, with many of his patients coming in describing how their family members just seem slightly off. They're cold, void of emotion in a way that comes off as almost ominous. And as the film progresses, it becomes clear that this mass hysteria actually had merit, with Miles and Becky encountering a town full of individuals possessed by one singular alien hive mind, now possessed with the one sole goal of spreading the infection further, starting with Santa Mira, extending to the rest of the United States, and eventually the rest of the world. So then, how does this film connect back to American culture, you may be asking? One word: communism. And that's not an exaggeration, I promise you. That's just quite literally the extent of this film's initial cultural impact. The end of World War II and the growing intensity of the Cold War conflict between Soviet Russia and the United States brought about a period known as the Second Red Scare, an era that changed the way Americans perceived those around them, citizen or otherwise. Fundamentally, the Second Red Scare, taking place during the 1940s and extending into the 50s, refers to an America dominated by the fear of Russian Soviet spies infiltrating the country, undermining society, and overthrowing the federal government. An America terrified of those around them for fear of ulterior motives. Sound familiar? It should. And the animosity present in these 20 years reflects that present in Santamira almost perfectly. And thus, I draw your attention back to the year in which Invasion of the Body Snatchers came out, 1956, right in the middle of the Cold War. The film's historical inspirations did not go ignored by any means, hence the 1970s remake and the eventual video game adaptation somehow. But even beyond the history, the concept of the unknown is something that makes people naturally very uneasy. So thus you end up with a film that is timeless, but especially impactful on those who lived during this particular period of American history. This concept isn't just applicable to the Cold War, though, and connections between horror and history can be drawn everywhere in cinema. Everywhere from the rise in AI-centric horror, following the dawn of the information age in the 1960s, as seen with films like Lawnmower Man, if it wants to show up, Lawnmower Man or Chopping Mall, all the way up to the excessive gore and dramatics of 80s horror, as inspired by an oppressive America, as seen with films like The Evil Dead and Friday the 13th, all the way up to post-9/11 horror, where tragedy inspired the popularization of the hopeless, horrific ending, as seen in the original Saw. And therein lies the answer to my question of why I find myself loving horror, this idea of relatability. Art as an expression of oneself is nothing new and can be found everywhere, regardless of time, place, or identity of creator. However, art for many is not only about expressing oneself, rather it is about sharing that expression with others and making connections as a result. Horror films that build on our shared experiences as Americans, as people, accomplish that. When directors create characters that are subject to the same stressors that we cannot face ourselves, whether that be individually or communally, we find ourselves relating to them, putting ourselves into their shoes. Furthermore, horror films have to elicit very specific negative emotional reactions from people at a very specific time. So, being able to tap into the deepest recesses of the human psyche, but then to also give an audience a space to express the resultant terror, is something that is remarkably therapeutic for so many. And it's often the root of why so many individuals find themselves falling in love with the genre like me. In a paradoxical way, horror makes us feel relieved. Through horror movies, we find characters subject to the same nightmares that we cannot face on our own. This could be things like foreign threats, as I said previously, the impending climate crisis, and most recently, and most relevantly, the COVID-19 pandemic. I won't harp on this for very long because we all know how COVID has affected our lives, but COVID has essentially flipped our world on its axis, ripped agency out of our hands at every level. And so then we have to wonder how our artists, writers, and filmmakers are going to respond. It'd be no surprise that, like the Cold War, such a world-altering event as the COVID-19 pandemic would pave the way for a new era of horror, an era of horror that changed the way the genre would function. Post-COVID-19 horror would stand at something of a forked road, though, as probably the most obvious choice for a film centered around infection and illness would be like a zombie movie or something at least taking place during an apocalyptic setting. But I think we can do a lot better than that, and it's also really, 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 really cliche. So what else is there? Well, a primary characteristic of this most recent pandemic has been this idea of mass involuntary isolation, a concept universal in its relatability and unique to our present day. This theme can be adapted in many subtle ways that support many different types of narratives, while still pulling organically from culture and leaning towards an era in horror cinema defined and characterized by its loneliness. To create effective pandemic horror, one does not necessarily need a pandemic, rather, just the responses that come with one. And thus, building on humanity's base fears of isolation, illness, and an invisible enemy, post-COVID-19 horror will likely weave these evolutionary fears in with those of the time. In turn, audiences will never look at horror films the same way again, at least not until the next major world event occurs, which at this rate might be very soon. We will be perpetually aware of the despair a character feels when their enemy is hidden amidst the shadows or in their own mind, forever conscious of the person next to them, simply because it's what our world has demanded of us these past couple of years. Nope. 1 second. Hang on, I'm not done. Give me 2 more minutes of your time, maybe. So yes, I love horror films because they scare me, but not because I love being scared. It's been well established at this point that I'm no masochist, but rather because my fears and anxieties about the world have been recontextualized in a space where terror is expected and supported. Being jump-scared by an allegorical fictional threat is cathartic in a way not much else is in film or in life. Watching a character escape an alien onslaught, take down a terrifying monster, or overcome psychological turmoil is comforting to us. It comforts us with the knowledge that maybe one day we may be able to take down our own monsters too. Thank you.